Hi there! Today we're going to be talking about how to write a conclusion for an academic paper. As with the other videos in this series, this is designed to be a general overview that can be applied to different types of academic writing. However, for specifically what you need to include in your conclusion for a given assignment, always consult the guidelines of that particular assignment first. So first, let's talk about some of the main things that a good conclusion should do. So a conclusion is your last word in the paper, which means that it's the ideal place to really try to emphasize whatever the main takeaway you want the reader to have is. This is your last chance to reach your reader with your ideas and really try to convince them of what you're saying. So usually, although you do want to be summing up all of the things that you've discussed in the paper, you don't want to be adding in too much new information. So typically there are no new quotes or anything like that in the conclusion. Basically what you're doing is you're taking all of those different examples that you've talked about in your essay and you're putting them back together in light of the way that you've discussed them throughout the paper. Because now your reader has kind of seen where you were going with your argument, they've seen all of your evidence, so this is kind of your last opportunity to put that all back together into the message that you want them to be left with. So the biggest way to do this, or the biggest job that your conclusion has, is really to emphasize why your thesis statement, why your main idea is important, what's relevant about it to the reader, the main thing that you want the reader to take away from that message. And one of the biggest difficulties that I hear people express with organizing and finding things to put in a conclusion is that since you've already mentioned all this stuff in the paper, what are some ways to really say it differently in the conclusion? So hopefully going over the structure of the conclusion and some tips for rewording those key elements will help give you some ideas in that regard. Okay, and then the very last thing that a good conclusion should do is finish strong. You want to have what's called a clincher statement of some type. You want to end on the most powerful and conclusive note that you possibly can. So we're also going to be looking at some strategies for how to do that. Okay. So one possible conclusion structure that you can use, this one is fairly handy for 5-paragraph essays, things where you had a thesis statement that specifically mentioned your supporting points in it. So the first thing that you can do is sort of revisit your thesis statement. This can be in one sentence, this can take up several sentences. Sometimes it's a bit easier to sum up your thesis statement in several sentences because that way it's easier to find a new way to word it as compared to trying to turn, say, a one-sentence thesis statement into a one-sentence different version of it. There isn't really as much to work with there. So sometimes elongating your thesis into several sentences is one way to restate it in the conclusion in a new way. And then once you revisit your thesis statement, one way I like to think about what the conclusion does is that it's answering the so what question. So your reader may be sitting there going, okay, well, I've read all your examples, I saw all your evidence, I know what your main idea is, but why should I care about this? What do you really want me to know about this? So yeah, try to put yourself into your reader's mind and try to imagine what you think would convince them the most of your argument or show them most clearly what is significant about the argument that you're making. Another way to think about this is to imagine what is one thing, if your reader could remember one thing from this paper, what would it be? Or if you want to leave them thinking about something on their own, what would you want to leave them thinking about? These are some different ways that you can really close off or add to your conclusion so that it has that more substantial takeaway for your reader. And then to wrap up the entire thing, you have the clincher sentence, which is supposed to be sort of a more profound or punchy type of sentence, just something that really makes it feel like the paper has concluded. This can be one of the trickier parts to write, so like I said, we are going to be going over some specific strategies for that later on in this presentation. All right, so now that we've looked at all those elements, let's look at one way to revisit your thesis statement. And this is just a very simple sort of example of the way that you can stretch out your thesis statement into several sentences based on your supporting points or the specific examples that your body paragraphs were talking about. So in your introduction, for example, you might have a thesis statement that has your main idea followed by a couple different points, in this case A, B, and C. You might not have those specific points. If you don't have those specific points listed in the thesis statement, try to go through your essay and figure out generally what each of your body paragraphs is about and try to use those as your supporting points in a structure like this. That can oftentimes work too. And then once you go into your conclusion, you can sort of have one sentence about each of the supporting points. So start with a sentence just to revisit that main idea. Generally, try to do this in different words if you can. You definitely don't want to be copy-pasting your thesis statement, even part of your thesis statement, from your introduction into your conclusion. You want to say it in a new way, but preserve that meaning of your main idea. And then following that sentence of your main idea, try to create one sentence to sum up either each of your body paragraphs or each of the main sections of your paper where you are bringing in your specific examples, like the one shown here, where it goes from, it is clear that this was my main idea, while A demonstrates this aspect, looking at B is also apparent here, here, and here. And finally, C is one of the core components of the main idea too. So you take those A, B, and C points and sort of briefly revisit each one, just so your reader can sort of put them all together in the context of having read your specific examples throughout the rest of your essay. Yep. And then I just have a color-coded version of this that makes it a little bit easier to see how the different components of the thesis statement are then revisited in the example here. Okay, and then the next couple parts of a conclusion are pretty difficult to pin down. A lot of the content that will be following this revisiting of the thesis statement will depend heavily on what it is that you're writing about. However, there are some techniques that we can still discuss for coming up with a clincher sentence, so that final conclusive note to end the conclusion and the entire paper on. So some ways that you can create an interesting final sentence for your essay include maybe referring back to something that you talked about in the beginning, but casting it in a new light, talking about it in a little bit of a different way, maybe rephrasing, not just rephrasing, but also maybe recharacterizing it, showing it in a new way in light of the examples you've discussed. That could be one way to create an interesting, not just to create an interesting clincher sentence, but also to make the essay feel like it's sort of come full circle, while at the same time allowing the reader to learn more from the main parts of the essay. You can also use a sort of punchier sentence as your clincher sentence, something that's kind of clever or witty or funny. If you decide to go this route, especially if you want to introduce something that's maybe a little bit unexpected, just try not to deviate too far from the tone of the rest of your essay. For example, if you've written a very serious essay, you probably don't want to go too funny with your final line or anything like that. But if you can think of a clever way to sort of allude to something or hammer home your main idea, then by all means go for that as well. Okay. This is another example to be careful with, but sometimes you can also include a source or a quote near the end of your paper. Some instructors will not want to see any quoted material or any new examples that haven't been used elsewhere in the text in the conclusion itself. However, sometimes you may find that a supplementary quote just helps to sum up what you were talking about. So maybe not making it the last line, but the lead-in to the clincher line could be another way to use quoted material in this case. But for this particular strategy, I would suggest checking with your instructor just to make sure that it's okay for a given assignment. Okay, and the last thing that you can possibly do to create a strong clincher sentence is to connect your topic to its larger context or some of the implications of that topic in kind of the broader world. One thing to be aware of here is that you don't want to go so broad where, you don't want to go to the point where you're drawing conclusions about things that are so universal or apply to so many different things that you can't actually prove it within the essay. So you don't want to go too broad with this. But if you can connect what you're talking about to why it's important to the world or why it's important to the understanding of the sources and texts that you've been looking at in your essay, then that can be another way to sort of re-emphasize that importance of your main idea. And all of these tips are from the Harvard University Online Writing Center. Okay, so those are some ways to finish strong, but what are some things that we want to avoid in a conclusion? Again, some instructors may be okay with some of these elements, while others will not be, but generally here are some things that I found it's good to avoid. As we said before, you don't want this to be a restatement of your introduction. You don't want to follow the same structure as an introduction. If anything, the conclusion is sort of the opposite structure of an introduction. So while an introduction, it's kind of like an inverted triangle, right? So it starts out with sort of a broader thing to draw your readers in, maybe some background and context about what your topic is, and then it gets very narrow with the thesis statement, whereas a conclusion is more like a typical triangle where it starts pretty narrow with your main idea, then it kind of goes outwards towards things more like the broader context, the implications, emphasizing that overall meaning for your reader to think about, and it kind of goes out from there. So it's almost an opposite structure, so don't just kind of copy paste your introduction and then work on it from there. Even with things like restating the thesis statement, you want to have a very original wording for it in the conclusion if possible. Okay, this next one is something that some instructors may be okay with, others may not be. These phrases like in conclusion, to sum up, in summary, sort of phrases that signal that you are starting the final paragraph of your essay. If you really can't think of another way to start it and it just feels like an abrupt shift going into the conclusion, then maybe words like these can be helpful to set it up, especially I'd say if you're writing for say in the sciences, I imagine something like this would likely be fine. However, especially with English classes and arts classes, I think instructors tend to not want to see these phrases that specifically talk about the essay itself and what the essay is doing. They don't like the phrasings or the structure to be too obvious most of the time. So if you can, if your writing is structured clearly enough, if you're revisiting your thesis statement in the first part of your conclusion, you shouldn't really need phrases like this if you're phrasing the rest of it and organizing it in a way that it's clearly your conclusion. Another reason I saw to not put phrases like this is because if your reader is nearing the end of your essay, they can probably tell by this point that there aren't any more paragraphs after it, so it would already be pretty clear that it would be your concluding paragraph. So yeah, you typically don't need to use these, but always consult your guidelines and ask your instructors to be sure if it's something you feel like would be helpful in a particular assignment. Okay, and the final thing to avoid in a conclusion is hedging or expressing doubt about the examples that you've talked about. This can also be a tendency when you're running low on ideas and aren't really sure what to add, especially if you're adding some broader context in an argumentative essay where you've taken a particular position on something. Sometimes there can be the temptation to say, oh, well, but you know, this is just like one of many opinions that are out there. There could be other possibilities. The conclusion is not the best place to do that. If you want to talk about the fact that there are many other possible viewpoints or interpretations of something, your introduction is the best place to do that, ideally before your thesis statement as well, when you're providing that initial background and context. By the time you get to your conclusion, you just want to be emphasizing and strengthening your main point, and adding in any type of doubt or hedging about your main idea will just weaken your main point if that's included in the conclusion. And all these writing tips are likewise from Harvard University's Online Writing Center. Okay, and then the final thing is just to look at our sample conclusion here, which is from Cambridge Rindge and Latin School's Writing Guide, which I think shows how you can revisit the specific examples that you've talked about in your essay to really just put them all in one place, sum them all up, briefly remind your reader of what all those key takeaways from the essay are, and then re-emphasize why taking these ideas into consideration is so important and what you want the reader to take away from the essay as a whole. And this example too will be posted somewhere around this video so that you can go over it more easily that way. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on conclusions. If you have any further questions in this regard, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And be sure to explore the rest of this page for more information on how to write your best conclusion.